Up until very recently, it could have easily been said that we live in a very death-denying culture. Scholars have said that one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic has done for us in our world is remind us of something that our forebears knew only too well. And it's something we've known since the beginning of humanity. It might be new for us, but it's not new for the human race. In other cultures, older cultures, and certainly within Christianity, there is a high value placed on a thing called the remembrance of death. In fact, there's a fancy Latin term for this, memento mori, to be aware of our own mortality. Now, this is not done in a kind of a morbid surrender that life is pointless, but it's simply the awareness that life is precious, life is fragile, and life is a gift. And then to act accordingly. That's memento mori. And when the journey of someone that we care for comes to an end, to acknowledge that in a healthy way, and certainly if you're a believer, to let our faith guide us through that journey. It's interesting that in 1 Thessalonians we read this epistle at our funeral services, and it begins with Paul saying, "I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who will fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as those who have no hope." He doesn't say don't sorrow, but he says don't sorrow, don't grieve like somebody without hope. But the hope that is part of our faith, certainly part of this season we're celebrating now, that's the thing that guides us through the grieving process. Sometimes we hear people say that funerals are for the living. And I have a feeling that this sort of transformation in funerals, from funerals to celebrations of life, if you look at an obituary, people's lives are being celebrated all over the place. And I have a feeling that that transition comes from this idea that funerals are for the living, because the living celebrate the life of the person that died. While they certainly do help us in our grieving process, funerals certainly are for us and to help us process that and to work through it, but they're much more than that as well, because funerals also benefit the departed. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, there is a passage that is very important in terms of how we understand prayer for the dead. So, Paul writes to Timothy, "May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he sought me out very zealously and found me." Then he says, "The Lord grant to him that he may find mercy from the Lord in that day." And this, may the Lord grant him mercy in that day, biblical scholars, including Orthodox and Catholics and Protestants, by the way, understand that this is a prayer for Onesiphorus after he died. So Paul is commemorating somebody who has died, saying a prayer for that. Now the saints teach us that it is the belief of the Orthodox Church that our prayers for the dead offer them comfort in some way. You can't really understand that because we're not dead yet. But that we believe that our prayers for the dead offer them comfort in some way. You see, we can no longer embrace our departed loved ones with our arms, so we embrace them with our prayers. Our memorial prayers are ways that we tell our departed loved ones, "I love you." They are ways that we tell them thank you. And let's not forget that they can also be ways that we tell the departed, "I forgive you." Now, when we celebrate a memorial service like we do in our tradition 40 days, a year later, even 10 years later, what we understand, you see, is that these memorial services are really a continuation of the funeral service that we had for that person when they died. So it's not like they're new services in a sense. but they're an ongoing remembrance. And it's almost like all these prayers layer together as one collective prayer for the departed, the same prayer extended throughout time. And so we keep praying, and that's how come all the memorial prayers are the same all the time. And that's how come we get them from the funeral service, because it's all one big collective prayer for the person who died. Now, the reason that I say all of this is because we have to remember that the people who we commemorate today in the church year, chiefly the myrrh-bearing women, but also Joseph and Nicodemus, we celebrate their memory because they were committed to giving their teacher a proper burial. It was all about making sure he had the funeral that he deserved. On Holy Friday, it's late in the day when Jesus dies. And of course, sunset, that's the beginning of Sabbath. You can't work on the Sabbath. So you have to bury him. They have to bury him quickly. They have to do something quick. So Joseph says, you know what? I have a tomb set up for me. It's not far from here. We can bury him there. Now, can you imagine? Think about how much it costs to pre-plan a funeral. How much it costs to buy a funeral plot today. Because, I mean, this thing was hewn out of the rock. It wasn't cheap. And Joseph said he can have it. And Nicodemus, gathering all the things that they needed to prepare his body. You know, it'd be like today in our parish of some, okay, who's getting the wheat? Okay, who's got the wine and the oil? See, that was Nicodemus. That's what he was doing, to make sure they had everything they needed to prepare the body. But the problem was that they ran out of time. They managed to wrap him in the linen and put the spices and that and get him in the tomb. But that's all they had time for. They couldn't finish everything. But these women that we remember today, they would not stand to see their Lord, who they had spent so much time with, buried in an improper way. And so very, very early on the Sunday, see, the Sabbath is over, and early on the Sunday morning, they go to the tomb with the myrrh to anoint his body. And even though it's going to be trouble, because there are guards at the tomb, and even though they haven't really worked out their entire plan yet, right? Who's going to roll the stone away from the door? I haven't figured that one out yet. But they go anyway. You see, this whole thing is an act of love. And it's about remembering. It's about these people who said he has to have a proper burial. Now, these women, you see, out of their love, they go to the tomb, and because of their love, they become the very first people in history to hear the words that we repeat over and over and over again every year at this time: Christ is risen. Because of their love. All right. So what's the overarching life lesson? Funeral services, memorials are important, absolutely. But the overarching life lesson is that there are no insignificant acts of love. If you're thinking about caring for somebody and you ask yourself, how could this possibly help? Do it anyway. Out of love, we act. And because of love, lives are changed. Both the life of the one that we are caring for, but also our lives as well. That's the message of the myrrh-bearing women. That even when odds are against us, just like them, we choose to love. And that choice is never wasted. That choice is always